Have you ever imagined what it's like to feel your heart broken right in the place you trusted most? I am Margaret Collins. I'm 63 years old, and today I've decided to open my heart to you. For decades, I lived believing my marriage was unshakable, founded not only on human promises, but also on God. I was the devoted wife, the present mother, the woman who actively participated in church and always believed that faith would be enough to shield my life from any storm. But what happens when the storm doesn't come from outside, but from within? Perhaps you know this feeling, the weight of betrayal, the emptiness of abandonment, the silent judgment of those who should have reached out. I, too, thought I'd never go through this. I was always taught to believe in the power of forgiveness, but no one prepared me for the silence that hurts more than words. Do you recognize yourself in this experience? It's as if the entire foundation of your identity suddenly crumbles, and the woman you once were ceases to exist. I still remember the day I found out. It felt like the world stopped. The air left my lungs, and inside my mind there was only one question. Why, Lord? Trust me, the end is worth it. But before that, I had to face accusatory looks, harsh sentences, and even silencing within my own faith community. This next fact may change your perspective on what it means to truly believe in God when all seems lost. For a long time, pain followed me like a shadow. The nights were long, and prayers often sounded like muffled screams. And yet, it was precisely in this place of darkness that something began to happen. Little by little, I realized that my story wasn't just about betrayal, abandonment, or judgment. It was about something much deeper, something that would challenge me to see life and faith in ways I never imagined. And that's where the real transformation begins. I believed with all my heart that my marriage would be forever because we began at the altar before God. I was only 21 when I said I do in front of family, friends, and church members. At that moment, it felt like I was entering into an invincible covenant, blessed with eternal promises. I grew up believing that when two people are united in Christ, nothing can separate them. This conviction gave me security, as if love were a shield against any threat. For years, I carried this near-perfect image of life as a couple. I dedicated myself to my family, took care of the house, invested in church activities, and believed I was living within God's will. When people looked at us, they saw an exemplary couple, a living testament to what Christian union should be. Behind this appearance, I felt pride, but also a huge responsibility to never fail, to always be the ideal wife. This mindset made me swallow small discomforts because, after all, the narrative of a perfect life needed to be preserved. It's curious how the human mind can create invisible fortresses. I thought that simply. Starting at the altar guaranteed me automatic protection from any pain. I didn't understand that faith doesn't shield us from wrong choices, from human decisions, from secrets hidden behind the scenes of married life. This hidden truth took years to be revealed, but when it did, it had a devastating impact. At the time, I didn't see the signs, the prolonged silence, the repeated apologies, the slowly growing emotional distance. I justified it all by citing fatigue, the pressures of work, and ministerial commitments. My mindset was clear. If I remained steadfast, patient, and faithful, everything would fall into place. This belief, though well-intentioned, also blinded me to the reality unfolding before me. And when the mask finally fell, I realized that my faith had been placed not only in God, but also in an image of perfection that never existed. It was in this shock that something began to break within me, and my journey took an unexpected turn. I had to face not only the betrayal, but also my own illusions. But there is something even more essential here, something that few realize. I was a wife and a devoted mother, always active in the church, organized women's meetings, and for a long time felt fulfilled. My heart filled with joy as I watched my children grow up in a home I considered safe, surrounded by prayers, songs, and promises. I believed this was the true picture of the perfect family. Everyone gathered around the dinner table, praying before bed, engaged in activities that demonstrated devotion and faith. From the outside, we were seen as an example, almost like an ideal portrait painted on a canvas. But behind the scenes, there were details few noticed: and that over time would become cracks in what I believed to be unbreakable. My mindset back then was that if I fulfilled each role perfectly, everything would fall into place. I gave myself without limits. I cared for my children, encouraged my husband, attended services and meetings, and counseled other women. The impact of all this on my life seemed positive, but the hidden truth is that in the midst of this effort, I forgot about myself. I believed that happiness was an automatic result of service and dedication, and I never questioned whether anyone truly saw my needs or weaknesses. It was like living in a play. On the outside, applause and admiration. On the inside, insecurities hidden beneath a constant smile. I grew accustomed to donning the armor of the strong woman, unaware that it also weighed heavily on me. I often went to bed exhausted, but happy to have accomplished all the tasks. Little did I know that this absolute, uninterrupted dedication left me vulnerable, lacking the emotional reserves to handle the oncoming winds. Looking back, I realize how imprisoning the illusion of perfection can be. I thought my dedication was enough to support my family, but the reality is that someone else's decisions can completely change the direction of our journey. This was what hit me hardest, realizing that, despite all my commitment, it wasn't in my control to avoid betrayal. This revelation was harsh, almost suffocating. I saw the image I'd carefully constructed over years crumble before my eyes. And yet, it was precisely in this shock that my transformation began to take shape, even if I didn't immediately understand it. Little by little, life would show me that what I called fulfillment was nothing more than an incomplete version of the truth. And it is at this point that something unexpected manifests itself, something capable of completely changing the way we see not only faith, but also ourselves. When I think about everything I've experienced, I know that many women carry similar stories, even if they never have the courage to speak them out loud. Every detail of this journey carries weight, has an impact, and can become a powerful revelation for those who listen with an open heart. And that's why I need to tell you something very simple, but it makes all the difference. If this experience resonates with you, if at any point in my talk you recognized yourself or remembered someone close to you, like this video, it seems small, but it's not. When you do this message gains strength, reaching more people who also need to hear that they are not alone. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and continue to bring real stories that touch us deeply and help us see life from a new perspective. If this topic resonates with you, please leave a comment below with your thoughts. Your words could bring relief to another woman who may be silent right now, unsure how to respond to her pain. This space is more than a screen. It's a community of faith, empathy, and transformation where every gesture counts. And as I share this part of my journey, I realize how even the darkest moments carry seeds of change. Because when the hidden truth finally comes to light, it forces us to face decisions we weren't ready to make. And that's precisely when the course of history begins to change. I began to notice small, almost imperceptible changes that I initially didn't want to acknowledge. The silence that had once been comfortable, a peaceful space after a long day, began to feel uncomfortable, charged with something I couldn't name. Excuses arose in simple situations, delays explained by meetings that never happened, messages that took a long time to be answered, glances that strayed from mine. These were details, but something inside me screamed that there was a hidden truth there, lurking beneath the surface. I tried hard to avoid conflict, to maintain the appearance of harmony, but with each new evasive gesture, a sense of distance grew between us. The mindset I had at the time led me to believe that any problem could be solved with patience and prayer. And indeed, many situations in life find answers in faith. But faith also calls us to see reality as it is, not just as we wish it were. I, however, preferred to cling to the image of a perfect family I had constructed, and so I rationalized the signs. I told myself it was just work stress, that people change over time, that maybe I was exaggerating. Deep down, I already knew something was wrong, but I wasn't yet ready to face the impact this revelation would bring. It's curious how our inner journey can be marked by small, seemingly insignificant decisions. Ignoring a change in behavior, accepting a prolonged silence, choosing not to ask too many questions to avoid creating friction. These choices, when repeated, build a barrier between truth and perception. I believed I was preserving peace, but in practice, I was building a wall of distance. It was as if I were behind the scenes of my own life, pretending everything was under control, while the play unfolding on stage was no longer the same. Looking into his eyes no longer brought the same security. There was something different, a coldness that I tried to cover with care and dedication, as if my effort were enough to restore what was slipping through my fingers. And this feeling silently gnawed at me, because even as I saw the signs, I refused to believe that my story could be about to fall apart. This contradiction consumed me. On one hand, trust in God, on the other, the fear of facing the truth. And it was at that point that I realized how dangerous denial can be. It doesn't protect us. On the contrary, it numbs us to the inevitable. The impact would come, sooner or later, and I sensed it. Even so, I carried on, trying to sustain a plot that no longer made sense. And it's precisely when we cling to this illusion of control that life confronts us with what we fear most, without masks, without excuses, with no room to escape. The day I found out felt like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. There was no preparation, no warning, just the sudden collapse of all my certainties. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind where routine seems so predictable that nothing unexpected could happen. But all it took was a forgotten message on my phone, a stray phrase, a clue that turned into an avalanche. In seconds, what was once trust turned into doubt, what was once love turned into pain, and I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. My body trembled, my hands grew cold, and my mind refused to accept what my eyes saw. I read and reread those words, as if searching for a logical explanation, an excuse that could soothe my heart. But there was none. It was confirmation of something I already feared in the back of my mind, but which I fought against with all my might. The betrayal was before me, naked and raw, with no room for justification. In that moment, I felt as if a part of me had died. It wasn't just the pain of marital disloyalty, but the devastating impact of realizing that years of dedication, prayer, and surrender seemed not to have been enough to prevent that outcome. It was as if the story I had so carefully built was ripped from my hands and torn apart before my eyes. The silence of the house, which had previously been merely uncomfortable, became an abyss. And along with the pain came an avalanche of questions. Where did I go wrong? Was I not good enough? Was my faith not strong enough? It's amazing how, in moments of shock, the human mind desperately searches for logic, even if that logic only makes us feel more guilty. I found myself faced with a cruel dilemma. Believe I failed as a wife, or admit that the person I trusted had made choices that destroyed not only the marriage, but also the image I had of her. This revelation drastically changed my mindset. I painfully realized that it's not enough to believe in promises made at the altar if, behind the scenes, there are secrets and decisions that go in the opposite direction. The hidden truth had come to light, and the impact was so strong that I felt unable to breathe. I walked around the house as if lost in my own home, looking at objects, photos, memories, and everything seemed tainted by lies. The feeling was one of betrayal, not only in my marriage, but also in my faith. I wondered how God could allow this, how the prayers I'd prayed so many times hadn't been able to prevent this destruction. It was as if the heavens had closed in on me. And at the same time, there was a silent part of me that knew this discovery was just the beginning of a much deeper journey, a transformation I couldn't yet comprehend. And it was precisely in this state of ruin that I realized that pain had the power to reveal not only the fragility of a relationship, but also the cracks that existed within myself, which I had never stopped to see. At my church, many didn't embrace me. Some blamed me as if I hadn't been enough. That space that had once been my refuge, where I felt welcomed and strengthened, suddenly became a place of harsh stares and whispered comments. I was already torn apart. Inside, trying to process the betrayal, but the reaction of people I considered sisters in Christ brought a new layer of pain. It was like carrying an open wound and, instead of receiving care, feeling like someone was throwing salt in it. The behind-the-scenes nature of the faith community can reveal painful truths. While some women approached me with genuine empathy, others chose to point the finger, as if the failure of my marriage were proof of my spiritual incapacity. The phrases were always disguised as advice. You need to pray more. Perhaps you lacked submission. A wise woman builds her house. And each word, though spoken with a tone of pity, felt like a cruel judgment piercing through me. I was already questioning myself, looking in the mirror for flaws, mentally reviewing every decision I'd made over the years. And then came this avalanche of external accusations, reinforcing the idea that I was responsible for something that, in reality, was beyond my control. The mentality I was instilled in me from an early age was clear. If a marriage fails, the woman should examine herself, because perhaps she wasn't dedicated enough. This belief, rooted in distorted traditions, weighed on my shoulders like an unbearable burden. And I wondered, where was the grace we so often preach? Where were the outstretched arms that should support us in times of failure? The hardest revelation was realizing that, in many cases, faith can be used as a tool of exclusion when it should be an instrument of healing. The impact this had on my journey was devastating. In addition to the pain of betrayal, I now faced silence and distance from those I most hoped would be by my side. It's hard to explain what it's like to feel invisible within a community that was once your spiritual family. I was physically present, but emotionally, I felt alienated, as if my voice had no value. There were meetings where I'd enter, and everyone's eyes would turn away, as if I carried a brand no one wanted to be associated with. This kind of rejection leaves deep scars because it undermines identity, erodes self-esteem, and raises doubts even about God's love. But it was precisely in this environment of judgment that something began to change within me. I realized that my faith could no longer depend on people's acceptance, that my identity could no longer be held hostage by the opinions of others. It was a painful but necessary awakening because it forced me to seek in God what I couldn't find in others. And this was just the beginning of an even greater transformation, one that would lead me to view silence in a completely different way. I heard phrases like, forgive and forget, but no one wanted to hear my pain. It was as if the suffering I carried was a nuisance to others, something that needed to be quickly swept under the spiritual rug. Every time someone told me I simply needed to move on, I felt like my voice was being ripped away. I didn't need ready-made answers. I needed to be heard. The silence imposed by the community became an even greater burden than the betrayal itself because it placed me in a place of invisibility. Behind the scenes of faith, there's often a mindset that avoids dealing with real pain. Talking about forgiveness is easier than delving into other people's wounds. But I discovered that this kind of advice, when delivered without empathy, imprisons rather than liberates. I didn't want to just recite verses and move on as if nothing had happened. I wanted to express my tears, my anger, my doubts, and yet it seemed that opening my heart was seen as a lack of faith. This contradiction suffocated me because I'd always believed in a God who welcomes, yet I encountered people who asked me to remain silent. The hidden truth is that many women experience the same kind of oppression disguised as pity. They are encouraged to keep their stories to themselves, to suppress their tears, to hide their wounds so as not to tarnish the image of their family or church. And this silence, instead of bringing healing, prolongs the pain. The impact is devastating. Loneliness intensifies, minds fill with doubts, and faith, which should be a refuge, becomes like a tribunal. I felt judged, even for simply wanting to speak out. I still remember the times I tried to share some of my anguish and received only canned responses. God already took care of it, they'd say. But inside me, the wound continued to bleed. How could I believe everything was resolved if I still woke up every night with my heart racing, reliving every detail of the betrayal? This chasm between what I felt and what they expected me to reveal created an almost unbearable internal conflict. I was facing a journey of transformation, but at that moment, I couldn't see it. It was during this process that I realized how dangerous it is to deny pain. Because when the voice is silenced, suffering finds other ways to manifest itself. In the body, in the emotions, in the mind. I languished in silence, carrying a burden that seemed to have no space to exist. And at the same time, within me, a deep desire grew to find a place where I could be true, without fear of rejection. It was this desire that led me to face loneliness in an unexpected way, as if it had something to teach me. Suddenly, I was no longer the exemplary wife, the active woman in the community, or the devoted mother everyone admired. I was the betrayed one. This word, heavy and cruel, seemed to stick to my skin like a brand that defined me entirely. Everywhere I went, it seemed like everyone stared at me, reminded me of this newly imposed identity, as if my entire history had been reduced to a single episode. Loneliness took over me in an overwhelming way, not only because the marriage had broken down, but because I no longer knew who I was outside of this role I had held for so many years. The days began to grow longer and quieter. Family gatherings, church meetings, even simple daily tasks took on a different weight. I would enter environments that were once so familiar and now feel like a foreigner, out of place, observing from the outside something that no longer felt like mine. The loneliness was not just physical, but emotional, as if my heart had been placed in an empty room where only the voices of judgment and rejection echoed. The impact of this isolation was profound. I, who had always counseled other women, who offered prayers and hugs in difficult times, now had nowhere to run. And the hardest revelation was realizing that, even surrounded by people, I was alone. It's a hidden truth no one likes to admit. The pain of betrayal carries with it not only the loss of the relationship, but also the loss of identity. I had to face the question I feared most: who am I now? In the background of my mind, a whirlwind of thoughts tormented me. Maybe I had failed. Maybe I hadn't been enough. Maybe this was proof that my worth wasn't as great as I believed. This destructive mindset eroded my strength and made me believe my life had lost its meaning. It's at this point that loneliness ceases to be simply the absence of company and becomes an inner abyss, a dark space where each memory hurts more than the last. And yet, within this darkness, there was a restlessness that wouldn't let me give up, a barely perceptible whisper that reminded me that the journey wasn't over, that there was something beyond this suffocating pain. Loneliness, though cruel, also opened the space for me to begin looking within myself, to perceive the cracks that had previously been hidden beneath the rush of everyday life. It was in this forced silence that I discovered questions I never would have asked if life had continued at the same pace. I didn't know it yet, but this same loneliness that seemed like my greatest enemy was becoming fertile ground for a transformation I never imagined I'd experience. Because, in the midst of absence, revelations are born that completely change the course of a story. I wondered, how could God allow this? Was I not faithful enough? These questions echoed in my mind relentlessly, like a hammer that wouldn't let up. I had spent years dedicating myself to prayer, Bible study, and church service, always believing that this faithfulness would be a shield against any tragedy. Suddenly, seeing my life shattered made me feel like all that effort had been in vain. Faith, which had once been my strength, seemed to be transformed into a field of ruins. The nights were especially difficult. Lying there, staring at the ceiling, I cried silently so as not to worry my children. The weight of doubt crushed me. If God truly loved me, why was I living this nightmare? I felt a sense of spiritual abandonment, as if heaven were closed to me. I prayed, but my words seemed to carry only the ceiling of my room. This disconnection was one of the scariest moments of my journey, because it directly shook the foundation that had always sustained me. In the background of my mind, a battle raged between the faith telling me to trust and the pain screaming that I had been forgotten. It was a conflict of minds, almost as if I had two voices inside me, one insisting that God remained in control, and the other questioning whether he truly cared about me. This inner division sapped my strength, leaving me vulnerable, unsure of which path to follow. The impact was so strong that I avoided church for a few weeks. The environment that had once brought me peace now brought back memories of judgment, rejection, and especially of this shattered faith that I no longer knew I could rebuild. Each verse seemed to accuse me more than comfort me. It was as if I were outside the story of God's promised care and had been forgotten behind the scenes. And yet, even in this chaos, there was something curious happening. I began to realize that my questions, painful as they were also leading me to a place of sincerity before God. It was the first time I felt completely naked in prayer, without masks, without rehearsed phrases, simply surrendering my broken heart. It was at that point that I realized a revelation. Perhaps faith wasn't about having all the answers, but about continuing to seek even when all seemed lost. This realization didn't yet heal me, but it opened a crack. As if amidst the rubble of my pain, a small light had emerged, timid, but capable of indicating that the journey wasn't over yet. I didn't know how or when, but within me began to blossom the idea that even shattered faith could be the beginning of a profound transformation, capable of redefining everything I'd believed until then. Realizing that even shattered faith could be a starting point gave me new hope. It was at that moment that I understood I wasn't alone, that other women also carried similar pain, even if they never had the courage to share it. And that's why I have a special request. If this story touches your heart and you feel that it somehow resonates with your own journey, please subscribe to the channel. It's not just a click, it's a way to show that this space needs to continue existing, that there's value in sharing difficult truths and revelations that can transform lives. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people who need to hear that they are not alone in their struggles. If this topic resonates with you, please leave a comment with your thoughts so far. Often, the words you write may be exactly the relief another woman is seeking. This space is more than a channel. It's a community where pain and hope coexist, where every story has a real impact. And as I open my heart in this way, I realize that even the hardest questions that once made me tremble were also guiding me toward a transformation I would never have chosen of my own free will. Because when everything seems to fall apart, that's when the journey begins to reveal new paths we never imagined existed. I even cried out in prayer, "Lord, why have you forsaken me?" I never imagined my voice could come out so charged with pain, with anger, with a mixture of wounded love and shattered faith. I could no longer maintain the composure of well-organized prayers with their beautiful words. What came out of me was a scream, a tear, a weight of despair that seemed endless. For the first time, I wasn't afraid to show God my fury. It was as if He were the only one who could withstand that flood of emotions without judging me. Anger overcame me in unexpected ways. I felt hatred as I looked at memories, at objects that had once represented unity and now seemed like mere symbols of lies. I even broke a photo frame, as if by destroying that glass, I could also erase the pain that coursed through me. But nothing changed, because the truth was already inside me, burning, demanding to be faced. The impact of this anger was overwhelming. It sapped my strength and at the same time, pushed me out of my paralysis. It was as if I needed to walk through that fire to discover if anything would remain standing after the flames. In the background of my mind, contradictory thoughts raced. Part of me wanted to believe everything could be restored, but another part, wounded and weary, could no longer bear the thought of pretending. This division gnawed at me, as if my very identity were at war. The love that had once been a source of security had become shaky ground, and the anger that arose from it was the only energy that kept me standing. At that time, I had no answers, only questions. Did God truly see me? Did the promise of care still hold true for me? Was my future doomed to be nothing more than a trail of ruins? These doubts were like stumbling blocks, tripping me up with every step. Yet, there was something almost paradoxical. Even in my cries, I spoke to God. I might have been furious, but I kept turning to Him. It was as if, deep down, a spark insisted on reminding me that, despite everything, I still believed He was the only way out. This phase of anger wasn't pretty, it wasn't organized, and it certainly wasn't what I'd been taught about spirituality, but it was genuine. And it was this authenticity, even raw and painful, that opened the door to a new revelation, that even anger can be a step toward healing, because it exposes wounds that can no longer be hidden. And it was precisely in this realm of intense emotions that something unexpected began to unfold within me. I thought about giving up on everything, even my life. That phrase still echoes within me because I know it was real, not just a passing thought. It was a feeling of profound exhaustion, as if I'd carried more weight than my heart could bear. When the pain reaches this level, you see no way out, no future, only emptiness. I woke up every day feeling like I was in a maze without doors, repeating the same steps, always returning to the same dark place. Rock bottom has its own sound, a deafening loneliness. I felt surrounded by memories that crushed me. Every corner of the house held a memory: the sofa where we laughed together, the table where we celebrated special occasions, even the kitchen where I prepared meals, believing I was raising a solid family. All of this became triggers that pushed me even deeper. It felt like I was living among ruins, trying to breathe amid the dust of a collapse. The psychological impact of this period was devastating. I would look in the mirror and not recognize the woman in my reflection. There was no longer any sparkle in my eyes, only a weariness that seemed eternal. The mindset that had always sustained me, that everything can be restored with faith, was shattered. I prayed, but my words sounded hollow. It was as if I were talking to myself. God's silence, or what I interpreted as silence, was more painful than the betrayal itself. I didn't just want answers. I wanted to feel that he was still with me, that he hadn't abandoned me in the midst of chaos. Behind the scenes of my heart, a war was raging. Part of me wanted to give up, to give in to despair. Another part, small and almost extinguished, insisted that I couldn't end the story like this. It was in this internal conflict that I realized something curious. Even at my lowest point, I still talked to God. Not in the beautiful, organized way I'd learned, but in groans, in tears, in questions that made me tremble. And perhaps therein lay the first revelation. I still believed, albeit in a fragile and confused way. This realization didn't eliminate the pain, but it opened a crack. It was like a crack in a thick wall, through which a ray of light entered. Small, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me understand that there was still something beyond that abyss. I couldn't explain it, but that spark became a silent resistance against giving up. And from that moment on, even without strength, I began to see that rock bottom wasn't a definitive end, but the beginning of a transformation I never would have imagined experiencing. One day, alone, I opened the Bible to Psalms and found comfort no one around me gave me. It wasn't planned, nor even an act of spiritual discipline. It was an almost desperate gesture, like someone gasping for air in the midst of suffocation. I was tired of hearing pre-written phrases, of feeling heavy stares, of trying to justify my pain in environments that didn't want to hear it. So, with tears in my eyes, I picked up the Bible, whose pages were already marked by years of study and prayer, and let it open on its own. The words that leaped out at me were like an unexpected balm. The psalmist spoke of things that seemed written for my own story: the pain, the persecution, the feeling of abandonment, but also the hope that God hears even the brokenhearted. For the first time in a long time, I felt someone understood my anguish. It wasn't the leaders, it wasn't the people in the church. It was God Himself reminding me, through His Word, that He hadn't abandoned me. With each verse I read, a new revelation emerged. I realized that the Bible was never a book of distant stories, but a reflection of our own journeys. There were accounts of men and women who also experienced betrayal, injustice, and judgment. They also cried. They also doubted. They also cried. But in the midst of it all, they found the strength to carry on. This hidden truth made me see that I was not a lost cause, nor an exception. I was part of a lineage of broken people who nevertheless were loved and restored by God. The impact of that moment was profound. It was as if a key had flipped inside me. I still felt pain, still cried, but I no longer saw myself as invisible. It was as if the Lord had taken me by the arm and said, "I see you." This realization changed my mindset, because it gave me the certainty that I no longer needed to beg for attention or approval from those unwilling to offer it. I had direct access to the source of comfort and life. It was then that I began to practice something different. Instead of running from or suffocating my pain, I took it to the pages of the Word. I read, wept, prayed, wrote notes in the margins, and realized that this silent dialogue with God was rebuilding parts of me I'd thought were lost. It wasn't an instant transformation, but a slow journey of small, daily revelations that gradually reshaped my heart. And it was in this process of reconnection that I understood something powerful. Comfort doesn't come from quick answers, but from constant presence. The word didn't erase what happened, but it began to show me that my story didn't end in betrayal or abandonment. And so a new flame began to ignite within me, paving the way for me to take the next step toward something even greater. Forgiving didn't mean going back. It meant freeing myself from the weight of hurt. I needed to understand this in practice because for a long time I associated forgiveness with reconciliation, with the idea that if I were truly a woman of faith, I should accept back the one who hurt me. But the hidden truth is that forgiveness isn't about justifying the other person's mistake, but rather about choosing not to carry the heavy chain of bitterness forever. It took me a while to see this difference because my mind was conditioned to believe that forgiving was forgetting. But forgetting is impossible. What happened left a scar on me. What changed was how I chose to deal with that scar. At first, the hurt was like a constant flame, burning inside my chest, rekindled every time I recalled the details. I mentally entertained angry conversations, imagined confrontations, rehearsed responses that would never be spoken. This cycle only imprisoned me further. That's when I realized, as I delved deeper into Scripture and my own sincere prayers, that true forgiveness was an act of personal liberation. I wasn't doing it for him. I was doing it for myself. Forgiving was a decision not to let the betrayal define my future. This change in mindset didn't happen overnight. It was a transformational process that required courage because it forced me to relinquish the sense of control that resentment brings. Resentment, as painful as it is, sometimes seems to give strength, as if it were armor against further disappointments. But in reality, it's an invisible prison. I needed to make the conscious decision to place everything before God, even when my heart was still heavy. Each prayer became an act of surrender, a way of saying, "Lord, I can't do this alone, but I choose to release this into your hands." The impact of this forgiveness began to manifest within me before I even realized it. The weight on my shoulders lifted, the nights became less agonizing, and life began to take on new colors, not because the pain had disappeared, but because it no longer dominated me. I still had memories, but they were no longer chains dragging me down. They became scars that, paradoxically, began to tell a story of resistance. It was in this process that I understood. Forgiveness isn't a favor to the other person. It's a gift to yourself. It's allowing hurt to no longer steal energy, anger to no longer fuel destruction, but rather a reminder that I've chosen a different path. This revelation opened the door to something I hadn't yet imagined, the possibility of reconnecting more deeply with people who could truly walk alongside me. And it was precisely in this opening that a new phase began to emerge, where I discovered something I never would have discovered had I remained trapped in resentment. I met sisters of faith who truly listened to me and showed me that I wasn't invisible. It was such a stark contrast to everything I'd experienced before that it seemed almost unbelievable. After so long feeling suffocated by judgment and imposed silence, I finally found women who didn't try to fix my pain with pre-written phrases, but simply sat with me, cried with me, and let me speak. There was no rush, no pressure, just listening and presence. This experience left a deep impression on me because I realized that God also uses people to restore what we thought we'd lost forever. These women weren't perfect. Each carried their own stories of wounds and struggles, but there was a hidden truth within them, the strength that comes from sharing vulnerability. Behind the scenes of our faith, it's easy to think we need to be strong all the time, that we need only showcase victories. But there, amidst intimate conversations, I discovered that true strength lay precisely in admitting weaknesses and still moving forward. It was an eye-opening impact because it changed my mindset about what it means to be a woman of faith. It's not about never falling, but about rising and helping others rise too. These meetings became a space of transformation. With each prayer we prayed together, with each shared testimony, my heart lifted a little more. That weight of invisibility began to dissipate. I was no longer the betrayed one, but someone who had a voice, who had value, who could still dream. And perhaps most importantly, I realized I wasn't alone. There was a network of women willing to carry each other's burdens together, and this brought a relief I couldn't find anywhere else. The revelation that came from this experience was clear. Faith was not meant to be lived in isolation. God created communion as a gift, and when it is lived authentically, the impact is liberating. These women became mirrors of hope for me. Seeing them face their own deserts, I understood that mine could be crossed too. And in this process, something new began to blossom within me, like a silent courage I never imagined I would find again. It was in this environment of genuine support that I realized my journey didn't end in pain, but was just beginning to expand in unexpected directions. I realized that I'm not an ex-wife, I'm not the betrayed one, I'm a beloved daughter of God. This revelation didn't come all at once, like a sudden flash, but was built within me, layer by layer, like someone rebuilding a house after an earthquake. For a long time, my identity was tied to the role I played: devoted wife, present mother, active servant in the church. When all of this was shaken, I was left without a reference point, unsure how to present myself to the world. But it was in the silence of my prayers, in the comfort of Scripture, and in the strength I found with other women that I understood that my essence lay not in any of these titles, but in God's unconditional love for me. This shift in mindset had a profound impact. I began to see myself in the mirror differently. I no longer saw just a woman scarred by pain, but someone who had survived a collapse and remained standing. It was like seeing scars not as signs of failure, but as testaments of resilience. I understood that my wounds didn't have to define me, but could be the starting point for a journey of transformation. This thought freed me from the invisible prison I had been harboring. Rebuilding one's identity is a slow process and requires courageous decisions. I had to learn to say no, to set boundaries, to recognize that my life no longer revolved around pleasing or maintaining others' image of me. I stopped living in the shadows of others' approval and began to place myself at the center of my own story. This wasn't selfishness, it was survival. It was the discovery that taking care of myself was also a way of honoring the life God gave me. The revelations that emerged from this process showed me that I didn't need to hide my pain, but I also didn't need to reduce myself to it. The impact was so great that even my prayers changed tone. They were no longer just cries of despair, but conversations of gratitude for each small step I managed to take. I began to realize that true strength lies not in never falling, but in getting up as many times as necessary. And little by little, this new perspective on myself began to transform the way I related to the world. I began to appreciate simple moments, to find joy in details that had previously gone unnoticed. It was as if my identity, now rooted in God's love, made room for a lighter, more authentic life. And it was in this context of reconstruction that new paths began to emerge before me, revealing possibilities I could never have imagined. Before, when I began sharing my story, other women stood up and said, "I've been there too." It struck me in a way I can't describe. I had spent so long believing my pain was a lonely burden, that my journey was marked by shame and silence, that hearing other voices echoing the same experience was like breathing again. It was as if, suddenly, the walls of isolation had fallen and a new landscape had opened up before me. The impact of this revelation was profound, because it showed me that vulnerability has transformative power. When we open our wounds, not to dramatize, but to reveal the hidden truth we carry, we create connections that go beyond appearances. I discovered that there were women around me who, behind seemingly firm smiles, hid scars similar to mine. The backstage of their lives also held betrayals, abandonments, judgments, and imposed silences. And upon hearing my story, they felt empowered to break their own chains of silence. The mindset that had previously held me back, that idea that I needed to keep everything secret so as not to appear weak, began to crumble. I realized there was strength in showing my scars. They were no longer signs of defeat, but testimonies of resilience. Sharing my journey didn't erase the pain, but transformed it into a tool for healing, not only for myself, but for others as well. It was as if each word spoken was a brick placed in the collective reconstruction of so many invisible female stories. These encounters showed me that testimony has a multiplier effect. One touched life inspires another, and thus a network of hope is formed. It was in this context that I understood that my voice, once stifled, now had purpose. It didn't need to be perfect. It didn't need to be free of tears. It just needed to be truthful. And in this process, I also realized that my own healing was deeply connected to the healing of others. When I spoke, I not only relived my journey, but also found new meaning in it. This journey led me to see the immense impact of not allowing our pain to remain hidden behind the scenes. When we bring to light what seemed like mere failure, we discover powerful revelations about who we truly are and how much we can still flourish. And it was precisely through this sharing that I began to notice an even greater transformation taking place within and outside of me, paving the way for steps I never imagined I had the courage to take. At 63, I thought my love life was over. This idea haunted me like a constant shadow, because for a long time I believed that love and marriage were synonymous with security, value, and purpose. When this structure crumbled, the first thought that overwhelmed me was, no one will love me again. I looked in the mirror and saw the wrinkles, the gray hairs, the marks of time, and all of this seemed to condemn me to a permanent loneliness. In my mind, I was not only a wounded woman, I was also a woman too old to start over. This mindset, combined with the pain of betrayal, made me believe I was already out of the game of life, as if my destiny was simply to wait for time to pass. The fear of never being loved again grew even greater when I observed how society treats mature women. It seems that after a certain age, we're pushed to the sidelines, as if we no longer have a right to the emotional stage. While men are seen as experienced, we're labeled as outdated. This has a silent impact on our self-esteem, because we begin to internalize the lie that we're no longer valuable. I myself came to think that my role had ended with the end of my marriage, as if my entire identity were tied to being someone's wife. But amidst this storm of thoughts, something began to shift. As I revisited my journey, I realized that this fear was also a hidden truth that needed to be exposed. I didn't need a relationship to validate my worth, because my worth came from something much deeper, my identity in God and the way I chose to live my life from then on. This revelation was transformative because it freed me from waiting for someone else to fill the void left by the betrayal. I understood that true transformation began within me, with the decisions I made every day to rebuild my self-esteem, to look at myself with dignity, and to see the beauty of the woman I still was. This process wasn't easy. I often cried alone, believing my destiny was to remain invisible. But little by little, I realized that invisibility only existed because I had believed in it. When I changed my mindset, I began to see new possibilities. I began to take care of myself, not because I expected someone to notice me, but because I deserved that care. I discovered joys that didn't depend on a partner, short trips, hobbies I'd never tried, friendships that grew stronger, simple moments that gained immense value. It was a rediscovery of myself, a reconstruction that opened doors to new revelations. And here's the curious thing. When I least expected it, I realized that the fear of never being loved again no longer held the same power over me. Because before any other love, I learned to love myself in a way I had never practiced before. And it was precisely this new perspective, lighter and freer, that began to transform not only the way I saw myself, but also how I opened myself to the world again. It was in this space of authenticity and courage that I realized that the journey still held surprises I never would have imagined. I discovered that true joy doesn't depend on a man by my side, but on God within me. This revelation didn't come from a powerful sermon or specific advice, but from a series of small moments that began to transform into something much greater. That's when I realized I no longer needed to fill every silence with bitter memories or seek confirmation of who I was in the eyes of others. Freedom began to blossom when I understood that my life wasn't condemned to solitude, but open to new ways of existing, lighter, more authentic, more my own. It was strange at first, because for years I believed that happiness meant having someone by my side, sharing my routine, making plans, and building a home full of memories. When that ideal crumbled, I thought there was no more room for sincere smiles. But little by little, I realized a new mindset was forming within me, that I could find meaning in the simple act of living each day fully. This change had an immediate impact. I started waking up no longer with the weight of what I'd lost, but with curiosity for what I could discover. I began to experience new things, short trips to places I'd never dared to visit alone, walks at dusk just to gaze at the sky, nights where I traded tears for reading a book that inspired me. I discovered hidden pleasures in life's shadows, details that had previously gone unnoticed because I was always busy maintaining an image of the ideal wife. Now, free of this burden, I could choose. And it was in this conscious choice that I realized that freedom wasn't absence, but presence, the presence of myself before life, without masks, without fear, just living. This freedom, however, wasn't a radical rupture, but a slow construction. Some days, the past still knocked on my door, bringing back memories and insecurities. But the difference was that now I had tools to deal with it. I no longer allowed myself to be imprisoned by pain, because I had understood that each decision was a chance to rewrite my own narrative. This hidden truth became a central point. I was no longer a hostage to what had been done to me, but a protagonist of the choices I could still make. And it was in this process that I realized something surprising. The joy I so desperately sought outside myself was not in external circumstances, but in the inner space God occupied within me. He didn't just mend the pieces of my heart. He showed me that life could be lived in a new way, with constant revelations, with an energy that came from within. I no longer needed anyone to tell me I was loved, because I felt it deep within. This transformation changed my outlook on everything. I no longer entered places as a woman scarred by betrayal, but as someone who had discovered her own strength. I no longer needed to hide my scars, because they told the story of my victory. Freedom showed me that the end of a phase is not the end of life, but the beginning of an unexpected journey, and it was precisely in this space of renewal that I began to see possibilities that previously seemed unattainable, as if life were just waiting for me to open my eyes to them. I discovered that true joy doesn't depend on a man by my side, but on God within me. This revelation didn't come from a powerful sermon or specific advice, but from a series of small moments that began to transform into something much greater. That's when I realized I no longer needed to fill every silence with bitter memories or seek confirmation of who I was in the eyes of others. Freedom began to blossom when I understood that my life wasn't condemned to solitude, but open to new ways of existing, lighter, more authentic, more my own. It was strange at first, because for years I believed that happiness meant having someone by my side, sharing my routine, making plans, and building a home full of memories. When that ideal crumbled, I thought there was no more room for sincere smiles. But little by little, I realized a new mindset was forming within me, that I could find meaning in the simple act of living each day fully. This change had an immediate impact. I started waking up no longer with the weight of what I'd lost, but with curiosity for what I could discover. I began to experience new things, short trips to places I'd never dared to visit alone, walks at dusk just to gaze at the sky, nights where I traded tears for reading a book that inspired me. I discovered hidden pleasures in life's shadows, details that had previously gone unnoticed, because I was always busy maintaining an image of the ideal wife. Now free of this burden, I could choose, and it was in this conscious choice that I realized that freedom wasn't absence, but presence, the presence of myself before life, without masks, without fear, just living. This freedom, however, wasn't a radical rupture, but a slow construction. Some days, the past still knocked on my door, bringing back memories and insecurities, but the difference was that now I had tools to deal with it. I no longer allowed myself to be imprisoned by pain, because I had understood that each decision was a chance to rewrite my own narrative. This hidden truth became a central point. I was no longer a hostage to what had been done to me, but a protagonist of the choices I could still make. And it was in this process that I realized something surprising. The The joy I so desperately sought outside myself was not in external circumstances, but in the inner space God occupied within me. He didn't just mend the pieces of my heart. He showed me that life could be lived in a new way, with constant revelations, with an energy that came from within. I no longer needed anyone to tell me I was loved, because I felt it deep within. This transformation changed my outlook on everything. I no longer entered places as a woman scarred by betrayal, but as someone who had discovered her own strength. I no longer needed to hide my scars, because they told the story of my victory. Freedom showed me that the end of a phase is not the end of life, but the beginning of an unexpected journey. And it was precisely in this space of renewal that I began to see possibilities that previously seemed unattainable, as if life were just waiting for me to open my eyes to them. Today, I can remember the pain without drowning in it. It has become a scar and a lesson learned. This doesn't mean I've forgotten what happened, or that the suffering is no longer part of my story. It means that, when I look back, I no longer feel that weight that crushed me. What was once an abyss is now solid ground, where I can walk and even find beauty in the scars I bear. The tears that were once constant have given way to a serenity that surprises me, because I never imagined it would be possible to see betrayal and abandonment from another perspective. This transformation happened because I decided to face the hidden truth I'd long refused to accept. Pain is a part of life, but it doesn't have to define me. I've learned to revisit my past without getting stuck in it. When I remember the day I discovered the betrayal, for example, I no longer feel that sense of absolute despair. The impact is still real, but now it's accompanied by awareness and strength. It's as if I can say to myself, "You survived, you made it through, you transformed." This new mindset brought me powerful revelations. One of them was realizing that life isn't a straight line, but rather a journey full of twists, turns, and twists and turns that no one sees. What seemed like the absolute end became a turning point, an opportunity to rediscover who I am and build a more authentic existence. This awareness allowed me to look back and recognize not only the pain, but also the woman I was, with her decisions, her weaknesses, and her courage. Today, when I share my story, I no longer speak as someone mired in suffering, but as someone who has transformed that suffering into testimony. This change has a profound impact because other women can see that it is possible to get through and emerge stronger on the other side. The lesson isn't just in surviving, but in allowing each scar to tell a story of overcoming. And perhaps the greatest revelation of all was realizing that I hadn't lost everything, as I initially thought. On the contrary, I gained a clearer vision of what truly matters. I discovered that my life didn't end with the separation, that my identity wasn't tied to the title of wife, and that my worth didn't depend on who stayed or who left. The past is no longer a prison, but an open book that reminds me daily of the transformation I've experienced. Looking back, I realize that every tear watered the soil where new hopes now blossom. And it is precisely this blossoming that leads me to even firmer steps, because I know the journey didn't stop here. It continues, revealing paths I never would have imagined. My faith not only survived, it was rebuilt on a firmer foundation. When I think back to the days when I cried out to God, asking if He had abandoned me, I realize how radically my spiritual journey has transformed. Initially, I believed that true faith was one that never wavered, that remained intact even in the face of the greatest storms. But I learned, through my own failures, that authentic faith is not the absence of doubts, but the decision to continue even when nothing seems to make sense. It was in this process, amidst tears and silence, that I understood that God had not turned away from me. It was I who had to cross the valley to discover how real His presence was. With each step of this journey, I experienced revelations that completely changed my mindset. I discovered that faith isn't just built on illuminated altars, but mainly behind the scenes of pain, where no one sees. It was in these hidden moments, in broken prayers and lonely nights, that I perceived God's voice more clearly than ever. It wasn't a deafening scream, but a gentle whisper that reminded me, "I am here." This understanding had an immediate impact because it transformed my outlook on spirituality. Before, I believed I was strong because I didn't question. Now I understand that my strength lies precisely in being able to question and still cling to hope. This rebuilding of faith has brought me a sense of freedom I've never experienced before. I no longer feel the need to prove anything to anyone, nor to fit into molds that suffocated me. I've learned that faith isn't a performance, but a living relationship with God, built on truth, surrender, and even my weaknesses. This hidden truth has changed the way I approach life, because now I walk with more authenticity, knowing that my spirituality isn't conditioned by human expectations, but by divine grace. The impact of this restoration was so profound that even the way I see the future changed. What was once fear and uncertainty is now hope. Not because I have all the answers, but because I know in whom I trust. This new, firm foundation gives me the courage to move forward, to make decisions clearly, and to face new challenges without the paralysis that once dominated me. My restored faith hasn't erased the scars, but it has transformed them into reminders that I can overcome the impossible when I walk with God. And it was precisely this inner renewal that opened the door to something even more surprising: the possibility of seeing purpose in the pain that so wounded me. The betrayal that nearly destroyed my faith became the stage where it was rebuilt with even greater strength. Today, I can say that the woman who once found herself at rock bottom no longer exists. In her place has emerged someone who understood that faith is not theory, but daily practice, sustained by decisions that shape not only one's spiritual life, but one's entire journey. And it is with this renewed perspective that I move forward, knowing that the story did not end with the fall, but continues in constant transformation, revealing new paths that lead me to something even greater. If this story spoke to your heart, I invite you to leave a comment sharing what touched you most, because often, one word from you can be exactly what another woman needs to read to feel welcomed. When you interact here, it's not just a simple gesture. It's part of a collective journey, where stories intertwine and create a space of strength and hope. Share this video with someone you know who might be going through something similar. You can't imagine the impact a story can have when it arrives at the right time. And if you want to continue following these real stories of transformation, faith, and overcoming, subscribe to the channel. This is how this space grows and reaches more women who need a breath of courage to move forward. Because each testimony is not just about the person who experienced it, but about all those who recognize themselves in it and find the courage to write new chapters in their lives.